Mary Jackson had always believed that the hardest part of her job wasn't carrying heavy buckets, climbing stairs to clean unreachable windows, nor even the strong smell of chemicals that would cling to her hands for hours. What truly hurt was the constant feeling of being ignored. Not invisible exactly, because everyone noticed when she forgot a trash can or left a hallway unpolished, but ignored as a human being. At Jefferson High, an elite school in the heart of Boston where the corridors exuded a mix of privilege and pretension, Mary was just another cog at the back of the machine. At 68, with knees already tired from climbing up and down stairs, she went about her daily routine quietly, always punctual, always efficient, and always off the radar. It was early November, the kind of morning when the cold seems to seep into your bones. Mary arrived at the school before 7, just as she had done for nearly 16 years. She had a ritual. She drank her black coffee in silence in the staff break room, listening to AM radio while checking the list of rooms assigned for the day. Her life followed an almost unchanging pattern, and perhaps that kept her going. She had lived alone since her younger sister, Rose, had died 5 years earlier. She had no children, never married, and avoided talking much about the past, especially with co-workers like Miguel, the Mexican janitor with whom she shared brief confidences always during the lunch break. Mary was a woman of few words, but of many thoughts, and almost every day these thoughts returned to a place where she had never really been able to stay: university. That morning, an unusual incident shattered her routine. Maintenance had received an urgent call about a possible leak in the radiator of room 304, which coincided exactly with the second half of the advanced mathematics class. Mary usually avoided interrupting classes in session. She preferred to wait for the break to enter the rooms. But since the call had been registered as risk of electrical infiltration, she knew she had no option. She grabbed the cart with her equipment and went up to the 3rd floor. As she approached the door of room 304, she heard Professor Mark Anderson's voice echoing. It was a firm, almost theatrical tone, the kind that fills the room and makes students sit up straighter in their chairs. Mary knocked discreetly and entered carefully. Mary's entrance interrupted the class for a few seconds. Some students turned around. Others continued copying notes. The professor looked directly at her and raised his eyebrows. Anderson was known for his impeccable appearance and his even more polished arrogance. He wore a tie every day, even when there was no meeting. He had a way of looking at people that mixed judgment with self-confidence. Seeing Mary approaching the corner of the room where the radiator was located, he did not miss the opportunity. "Good morning, Mrs. Jackson. You've arrived just in time. Could you help with this little problem on the board as well?" His tone was openly sarcastic. A suppressed laugh went through the room, like a collective whisper of mockery. Mary paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on the whiteboard covered in a complex equation. She was familiar with that kind of formula. Very familiar. Most of the students laughed on impulse, that kind of laughter that happens when someone wants to show that they understood the joke, even without knowing if they should find it funny. Some, however, looked visibly uncomfortable. Mary noticed that. She always did. She was used to observing without being noticed. Since childhood, she had learned to read faces, to detect tones of voice, to understand when humiliation came disguised as a joke. She continued walking to the corner of the room, keeping her gaze lowered, as if by instinct. She was there to check a faulty radiator, but now all eyes were on her. Not out of respect, but out of curiosity, as if she were part of an improvised comic sketch, and not a woman who had woken up at 5 in the morning, taken 2 buses, and cleaned 3 bathrooms before 7:30. Noticing the room's attention, Anderson decided to insist. "Come on, everyone. Maybe Mrs. Jackson here can shed some light on this little problem. After all, it's not every day we have such illustrious visitors." He gesticulated with fake elegance, and the sarcasm dripped from his words like honey-disguised poison. He loved these moments. To him, it was just an innocent little show, a way to pull smiles from the students in the middle of a difficult class. But for Mary, that hurt in a very specific way, because she already knew that dynamic. The joke was never just a joke. It was a reminder of where she was supposed to be and where, according to him, she would never belong. At the center of that room, in front of a board. The problem on the board was indeed complex. a partial differential equation involving implicit variables, with notations that not all the students had mastered yet. It was the type of content that required abstract reasoning, attention to detail, and familiarity with advanced-level theorems. Anderson knew that. Mary, too. She didn't look directly at him, but understood that it was an invitation laden with venom. If she refused, she would be seen as ignorant. If she tried and erred, it would confirm the stereotype he wanted to reinforce. It was a trap, and she knew it with the clarity of someone who had been cornered. Before, not in classrooms, but in life. Yet that day, something inside her stirred. It was not anger. It was not pride. It was a memory, an old echo. For a moment that seemed longer than it really was. Mary felt the floor of the room vanish beneath her feet. She saw herself sitting at an old desk on a snowy college campus, with a black-covered notebook open in front of her. She saw the board in another room, with even more difficult equations than that one. She saw herself at 19, trying to hide. Her chapped fingers from the cold because she couldn't afford decent gloves. She remembered the professor who refused to grade her tests, saying that someone like her should take technical courses, not theoretical ones. She recalled the day when, even though she was hungry, she solved an equation faster than the whole class, and still didn't receive any congratulations. In that instant, the silence of room 304 was filled with decades of memories that no one there could see. Mary let go of the cleaning cloth she had been holding and gently placed it on the cart. Her movements were calm, but inside her heart pounded strongly, not out of fear, but of something deeper, harder to name. It was the accumulated weight of everything she had had to swallow throughout life, about to overflow. She slowly turned her body, keeping her posture upright, and looked at the board with determination. The room fell silent once again. This time, a heavy, uncomfortable silence, as if everyone were waiting for something different to happen, but not quite sure what. Mary did not look at the professor, nor at the students. Her eyes were fixed on the equation, as if it were a language she had never stopped speaking, even in silence. The sound of Mary's footsteps crossing the room seemed amplified. Each tap of her shoes against the waxed floor was almost a slight against what was expected of her. No one knew how to react. One of the boys in the front row adjusted his posture, surprised. One of the, more studious girls lowered her eyes, embarrassed. Anderson maintained his smile, but now there was tension in his jaw, as if he were beginning to realize that perhaps he had underestimated her too much. Mary picked up the marker with her right hand, as if holding a sacred tool. She didn't write immediately. She spent a few seconds analyzing the structure of the equation, like someone reading a poorly constructed paragraph before rewriting it from scratch. Her gaze was technical, methodical, familiar. She began at the top corner of the board, reorganizing the terms of the equation. She used clear symbols, firm and precise lines. There was no hesitation in her movements. No gesture was decorative. The sequence she created indicated mastery, not luck. As she progressed, she applied advanced calculus concepts that not all the students yet knew, and made side notes to make the steps clearer. It was as if she were giving a class. One of the students, seated further back, discreetly took out her phone and started recording. Mary didn't notice. She was focused, immersed in a rare state, that in which someone returns to being exactly who they were before the world tried to erase them. It was about 5 minutes of pure silence, broken only by the sound of the marker scraping on the board and the creaking of chairs as the students adjusted restlessly. When she finished, she replaced the marker on its holder and stepped back. She didn't smile. She didn't pose. She just looked at the final result, as if critically evaluating her own work. Then she turned and, with the same calmness as always, walked back to her cleaning cart, grabbed the cloth she had left there, and left the room without saying a single word. No one was able to react immediately. It was as if reality had been suspended for a few minutes, and now everyone was trying to understand what exactly had just happened. For a few seconds after the door closed behind her, the room remained still. Mark Anderson stood, with his arms crossed, staring at the board as if he didn't quite understand what he was seeing. There was no longer room for irony. He knew what that resolution meant. It wasn't just correct. It was elegant, clear, and better explained than he himself would have done in front of a high school class. The students, still in shock, exchanged looks, unsure whether they should comment, laugh, or simply remain silent. One of them, the same one who had laughed the loudest at the beginning of class, whispered to the student next to him, "She knew everything. How come?" The girl, who had recorded part of the scene, just shook her head, unable to hide her expression of astonishment. Mark tried to resume the class, but his voice sounded different, offbeat, lacking his usual tone of authority. He made a quick remark about going back to the content of the textbook and turned his back to the board, but left nothing erased. Perhaps because he didn't want to, or perhaps because he couldn't. That equation, solved with such precision by a woman he considered incapable of grasping the basics, was now a visible reminder of his own arrogance. Meanwhile, in the corridor, Mary slowly descended the stairs, her eyes fixed on each step. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from nervousness. It was as if her body was still adjusting to the weight it had just let go of. She wasn't regretful, but she wasn't relieved either. She felt empty, as though she had spent too much time holding something inside her chest. Mary didn't go straight back to the maintenance room. She entered the second-floor bathroom, locked the stall door, and sat there for a few minutes. She rested her elbows on her knees and placed her hands on her head. Her mind was in turmoil, not because she had solved the equation. That had been almost automatic for her, but because of everything it represented. It was as if the past had collided with the present with such force that it left internal cracks. She thought of her mother, who sold lunchboxes downtown to pay for her education. She thought of her older brother, who said that mathematics wasn't a thing for a black woman. She thought of the teachers who pretended not to notice when she raised her hand. And she thought about how she had spent decades believing that no one would ever see what she was capable of doing. She didn't cry. Mary was never one for tears. She had grown up hearing that crying was for those who could afford the luxury of stopping. But that moment sitting there, she felt something flowing inside her, a kind of old mourning that she didn't even know she still carried. It was the pain of having let her true identity lie dormant for so many years, like a book forgotten on the last shelf of a dusty library. But it was also, in a way, a liberation, because now, even if no one said a word, even if they pretended nothing had happened, she knew. They knew. And that changed everything. The next morning, Mary arrived at the school in her usual way, 20 minutes before schedule, with a coffee in one hand and the key to her locker in the other. The radio in the staff room was talking about a snow forecast for the weekend, but no one really seemed interested. The buzz behind the scenes was different. Miguel, the custodian, commented without much ceremony, "What you did yesterday was like something out of a movie, Mrs. Mary." She cautiously looked up, surprised that he had brought up the subject. That white professor left the room even whiter, and that's saying something. He laughed to himself, but Mary didn't answer. She just shook her head with a half-smile as if she didn't want to give room for conversation, but also couldn't hide that she had heard. She already knew. What had happened would not go unnoticed. Indeed, it did not. The recording made by a student ended up circulating in WhatsApp groups among students. Someone shared a clip on Instagram, cut at the moment Mary was drawing the most complex part of the equation. There was no audio, just an image. But that was enough to set curiosity ablaze. Who is this woman? How did she know how to solve that? Can anyone confirm if she's a retired teacher? The comments ranged from disbelief to admiration. Even teachers discussed it in the cafeteria, trying to understand where she came from, what she had studied, why no one knew anything about her. Anderson, for his part, remained completely silent. He didn't touch the subject. He didn't make a joke. He even avoided crossing paths with Mary in the corridors, as if her very presence had become an embarrassing reminder. The students began to treat her differently. The timid greetings that had once come only out of courtesy were now more sincere. Some called her by her first name. Others, bolder, asked if she could teach that problem again. Mary responded sparingly, without fueling the subject, but she noticed something new in their eyes. Respect. Not that formal respect given to someone in a position of authority, but a rare kind of respect that arises when one witnesses something that dismantles what was once believed to be true. Gradually, The effect of the equation on the board began to spread beyond room 304. She became a symbol, even if she did not want to. And whether she liked it or not, she also became a turning point in the way the school dealt with those who had once been invisible. Mary did not seek recognition. She never sought it. But she could not deny that something was different now. Even the academic coordinator, who barely looked at her at the beginning of semester events, made a point of greeting her personally in the corridor. A simple gesture, but revealing. And that began to affect Mary in a strange way. She found herself thinking about the past more frequently, rewatching scenes she had avoided for years. She even started dreaming about numbers, as she did in college, and would wake up with a restless mind, as if something inside her had awakened. It was as if an old door had been opened, not by choice but by necessity. And now, however much she might have wanted to, it could no longer be closed. On that same Friday, shortly before the end of the day, Mary was in the side yard collecting trash bags when she heard fast footsteps behind her. It was Professor Anderson. He seemed different, less stiff, more human. He was without his usual blazer, his tie loosened, and with an expression that mixed hesitation and fatigue. He stopped a few steps away from her and stood in silence for a moment, as if not knowing how to begin. Mary said nothing. She continued tying the bag with a firm knot, one that wouldn't easily come undone. Only after finishing her gesture did she slowly lift her eyes. It was the first time they had looked at each other since that day in the classroom. Anderson cleared his throat, as if rehearsing a line that wouldn't come out as planned. He said he wanted to apologize. The phrase came out small, meek, almost visible. He tried to explain that he was having a difficult day, that his intention wasn't to humiliate anyone, that the comment was a poorly placed joke. Mary listened in silence, but it wasn't the passive silence of one who swallows insults. It was silence laden with history, with layers dating back long before that episode. And then, for the first time, she spoke, not with anger, but with firmness. She said that this was not an isolated incident, that it wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last, that someone like her was treated as if she were always in the wrong place. She spoke about Columbia, about the years in college facing sideways glances, teachers who refused to call her by name, unfair evaluations, and closed doors. She recounted leaving college not because she wasn't good enough, but because the world around her made a point of reminding her every day that her presence was a mistake that no one had yet corrected. She talked about how costly it was to dare to dream when everything around said it wasn't allowed. And most importantly, she spoke of the pain of having kept her passion for numbers hidden in a dark corner of her memory, like a relic of a life she never had the chance to fully live. Anderson listened to everything without interruption. For the first time in years, he had no ready answer, no defensive argument, no sarcastic remark. He simply listened. In the end, he just said that he didn't know, and that perhaps that was the problem. He had never tried to know. He said he had learned more from those few minutes of silence than from years of teaching, and that, if she would allow it, he wanted to find a way to repair, even a little, the damage he had done. Mary promised nothing. She only said that listening was already more than many did, and in that moment, among trash bags and cleaning product smells, the two of them seemed more human than they had ever been inside a classroom. The following week, Mary was called to the II administration for the first time in over a decade of working there. She assumed it was some administrative notice, perhaps a memo about changes in the cleaning schedule, but upon arriving, she noticed a different atmosphere. The school principal, Dr. Philip Lawrence, a man who rarely spoke directly with support staff, was waiting for her with the academic coordinator by his side. There was even a tray with coffee and cookies on the table, something unusual in meetings like this. The principal began by thanking her for her presence and praising the positive impact she had caused among the students. He said that the classroom episode had even been mentioned by parents who wanted to know more about Mrs. Mary Jackson. She listened with a neutral expression, but inside she felt the very ground of reality trembling beneath her feet. Dr. Lawrence then made a proposal. He wanted Mary to assume an honorary role as a mathematics assistant. He explained that she would participate in some classes help with special projects, maybe even mentor students interested in careers in exact sciences. He said it wasn't just about recognition, but about inspiration, that her presence in the classroom could change mindsets, open horizons, provoke reflection. Mary listened carefully, but as soon as he finished, she responded with the firmness she had learned to cultivate over the years. No. She declined the role, politely but without hesitation. She said she didn't need a title or a different badge for her value to be recognized. The problem wasn't that I was sweeping the floor. The problem was that no one ever stopped to see who was holding the broom. The refusal visibly disconcerted the principal, but Mary did not let the meeting end in silence. She suggested something different, to tell her story. She said that if the school truly wanted to change, it needed to listen. Really, listen. And that she was willing to share what she had lived through, not to be applauded, but so that others might learn to look beyond uniforms, beyond positions, beyond first impressions. The proposal was accepted immediately, and it was decided that at the next institutional event, she would have a space in the auditorium to speak directly with students, parents, and teachers. As she left the administration room, Mary felt her body light and her mind restless. It was as if she had finally found a way to give back what life had taken from her, not with anger, but with truth. In the days leading up to the event, Mary maintained her usual routine. She cleaned classrooms, restocked paper in the bathrooms, checked the supply spreadsheets, but something in her was different. It was subtle, but real. Her steps seemed firmer, her gaze more direct. Even the way she organized her cleaning cart seemed to have gained a new rhythm. Some students began to stop and talk with her in the corridor. Others handed her small notes of thanks. One of them, shyly, said that he had never seen a black adult solve math like that. Mary kept that note carefully in her purse, folded with care. She knew that this moment would be bigger than her, bigger than the school, and that, this time, her voice would not be ignored. On Friday afternoon, the Jefferson High auditorium was packed. It was rare to see so many people gathered for something not related to an award ceremony or a competition. Parents, students, teachers, and staff filled every seat. On stage, a discreet banner simply read, "Stories that inspire." Mary sat at the side, waiting for her turn with her hands resting on her lap. She wore the same blue uniform as always, her hair tied back with a simple Velcro clip and her badge with her name already faded. She had refused the offer to change clothes. "I want you to see who I am, the way I've always been," she told the coordinator. When her name was called, she calmly stood up and walked to the center of the stage. The auditorium, which until then had been murmuring among itself, fell into a dense silence. Mary held the microphone firmly and looked out at the audience. For a moment, her eyes roamed over the faces. Some she recognized at a glance. Others had never even greeted her with a good morning. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was calm, unhurried, no frills. She told them she was born in Roxbury, a working-class neighborhood in Boston, and that from a young age she had been enchanted by the numbers on grocery receipts and wall calendars. She said she had learned to multiply before she could write her full name. That she studied on a scholarship at a public school where the teachers didn't know how to handle her talent, and that, even so, she managed to get into Columbia. Many in the audience widened their eyes. Columbia. That seemed inconceivable, and that was the point. Mary spared no details. She spoke about explicit racism, the sideways glances, the teachers who made a point of discrediting her. She recounted the nights working as a janitor to pay for the next day's meals, the guilt of having to abandon her studies when her mother fell ill, the promise she made to herself to one day return, a promise she never could fulfill. She said that for decades she had hidden all that, because speaking out hurt more than remaining silent. But that day, in room 304, something changed. She said she didn't solve the equation to impress anyone. She solved it because she was tired of pretending to be less than what she truly was. And she finished, "There are many people like me, people you don't see, but who are here cleaning the floors of the rooms where you learn to become someone." When she finished speaking, there was no sound, only a thick silence, as if no one quite knew how to react. Then came the applause. Slowly, one by one, everyone began clapping. Not a formal, institutional applause, but something deeper, something more honest. Some parents wept, teachers stood up, students ran to embrace her at the end of the event. One of them, with teary eyes, said, "You made me believe that I can too." Mary smiled, not with pride, but with a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, the woman who cleaned the rooms was heard, and what she said continued echoing far beyond the school walls. In the days that followed the event, something changed at Jefferson High, and it wasn't just the speeches. The change began in almost imperceptible details. Students who had previously walked past the cleaning, staff began to greet them respectfully. Teachers who had never questioned their own privileges started paying more attention to how they treated those around them, and even the school administration began to move. The recording of Mary's speech, made by one of the parents present, was shared on social media, reached educators' groups, and within a few weeks had surpassed the school's walls. Her name began circulating as an example, not of charity, but of reparation, of truth. The school created a project called Invisible Voices, with monthly discussion circles between students and staff who had previously been ignored in everyday life. Security guards, cooks, cleaning aides. The curriculum for the citizenship class was revised, including topics such as structural prejudice, inequality of opportunities, and meritocracy seen from a new perspective. Some teachers publicly admitted that they had learned more from Mary than in years of courses and specializations, and it wasn't an exaggeration. Her impact was not academic, it was human. She not only exposed a systemic flaw, but showed, by her very existence, how much talent can be buried when the world refuses to listen. Mary never changed her uniform, nor did she ask for a new badge. She continued sweeping the corridors, cleaning the same rooms, taking care of the details that no one noticed when everything was in order. But now, she did not go unnoticed. The younger classes began to know her not as the janitor, but as Mrs. Mary, the one with the equation. The veterans greeted her with genuine respect. Some asked for advice, others simply expressed their gratitude, and there was always someone who asked if she ever considered going back to teaching. Mary smiled and calmly replied, "I already teach. It's just that you all only learn to listen to me now." Over time, Mary began to be invited to events at other schools, where she shared her story with the same simplicity as always. And even though she had never written a book, had no postgraduate diploma, and never attended conferences, she became a reference. Because deep down, her story spoke of something far greater than numbers. It spoke of dignity, of silent struggle, of the cost of carrying hidden talent inside oneself for decades, simply for not having had the chance to show it before. And because of all that, Mary Jackson became a symbol, not of individual triumph alone, but of a collective truth, that sometimes the greatest intelligences are right under our noses, and all it takes is someone to decide to see them. A few months later, on a cold winter morning, Mary Jackson arrived at the school as usual, but was greeted with something she never expected. A discreet banner at the entrance of Wing C, newly renovated, where the math classrooms now operated, bearing the words, "Mary Jackson Corridor, in honor of the invisible wisdom that teaches us every day." The initiative came from the students themselves, in partnership with a POW, group of alumni and teachers. Mary stood before the sign for a few minutes. She didn't take a photo. She didn't post it anywhere. She simply stood there, looking, with her hands in her pockets, and her eyes a little misty. It was as if that small, silent, and firm tribute had returned to her something that had been stolen from her long ago, the right to exist, with all her parts, within a space of learning. That same week, a new teacher, recently arrived at the school, sought out Mary during a day break. She was a young, black woman with braids and a curious gaze. She said she knew Mary's story, that she had watched the video, and that because of it, she had decided not to give up on an academic career even when hardly anyone took her seriously. Mary listened intently, and in the end, she simply put her hand on the young woman's shoulder and said, "Go for it, girl, but don't forget to pull others along when you get there." And that was the kind of lesson no diploma could ever teach. Because Mary knew, as few people do, that the greatest achievements are not just those that change one's own life, but those that pave the way for those who come after. In the following years, Mary's name began to appear in more places. She received an homage from the city hall, was the subject of a report in an education magazine, and even became a reference in an undergraduate thesis by a student studying pedagogy. But none of that changed her routine. She continued having the same coffee in the staff room, listening to the same AM radio, greeting everyone by name. Only now there was recognition where there had once been silence, a space where there had once been forgetfulness. Mary never sought glory. What she had always wanted was simply to be seen, not as an exception, but as proof that the world needs to stop judging people by where they are and start understanding where they have been. And on some late afternoon, years later, while cleaning an empty chalkboard in room 304, Mary looked at the board and smiled. There was no equation there, only remnants of erased words, smudged strokes, as if the lesson had only just ended. But to her, that board was more than just a marker panel. It was a mirror, a place where, finally, after so much time, she could see herself in entirety. And perhaps that afternoon, as she wiped away the last traces of some explanation, Mary understood that her greatest lesson was never about mathematics. It was about resistance, about truth, about the power of an ordinary woman who, despite being ignored for almost her entire life, taught an entire school how to do the right calculation.